50 of their most important outposts and 985 of their most famous villages were razed to the ground. 580,000 men were slain in the various raids and battles. Thus, nearly the whole of Judea was made desolate. The Bar Kokhba Revolt was one of the most disastrous events in Judaism's history, resulting in the deaths of 580,000 Jews. Led by Simon Bar Kokhba, the revolt, triggered by religious oppression during Roman rule, aimed to restore Jewish culture and identity. The rebels initially found success by using guerrilla warfare. However, after Roman military adjustments, the rebellion was completely crushed. As retribution, Emperor Hadrian massacred the Jewish people, exiling them out of their homeland, attempting to erase Jewish affiliation in Judea. This led Judaism into a more rabbinic-focused religion, ensuring its survival across the world. This event stemmed primarily from the constant persecution of Jews in Judea and the Roman Empire. Outrage sparked when Roman Emperor Hadrian decided to create a pagan city on the holy ruins of Jerusalem, particularly the site of the Second Temple. Angry civilians united under Simon Bar Kokhba sought vengeance and the permanent respect for the Jewish people. Instead of the glorious rebellion they had envisioned, like the Maccabean revolt 200 years prior, they were met with merciless destruction. At the start of the revolt, the Jews, using their complex tunnel systems and guerrilla warfare, appeared to be gaining the upper hand. But Rome struck back by appointing General Sextus Julius Severus, who led with tremendous reinforcements and the campaign for sieges. The Roman victory ultimately led to the Jews suffering atrocious fates, which included being brutally murdered, enslaved, and forcefully exiled from their lands. This marked a new beginning for Judaism, led by the teaching of Jewish law rather than the worship of their temple.
Tensions between the Jewish population and the Romans had already been extremely high long before the Bar Kokhba revolt. In 66 CE, the Jews openly revolted against the Romans after a land dispute between Jews and Greeks escalated into a violent riot after a Greek citizen desecrated a synagogue entrance. Corrupt governor Gaius Florus did nothing about this, rather worsening tension by ransacking a Jewish temple. This provided the Jews with a reason to rebel against the Romans. However, under the rule of the general and later emperor Vespasian, the Jewish revolution completely failed, and the Second Temple, the heart and soul of Judaism, was ruthlessly destroyed. Although there was another Roman-Jewish war afterwards, the events rarely included fighting in Judea, hence the name, the Diaspora Revolt. After the Diaspora Revolt, although there were high tensions between the Jews and Romans, there had been a period of relative peace, which would unfortunately not last for long. In 130 CE, Emperor Hadrian decided to visit Jerusalem. According to the Jewish Virtual Library, Hadrian, allowed them to return to Jerusalem and granted permission the rebuilding of their holy temple. The Jews' expectations rose as they made organizational and financial preparations to rebuild the temple. Despite this, Hadrian chose to go back on his word. After visiting Jerusalem, instead of rebuilding the temple, he built a new Roman city named Aelia Capitolina, and, more provocatively, directly on the ruins of the Temple Mount, he created a temple dedicated to Jupiter.
This betrayal shattered any remaining hope of rebuilding the Second Temple and provoked widespread outrage amongst the Jewish population. Understanding that it was their duty to defend their faith and homeland, the Jews prepared for armed resistance. However, since Hadrian is still nearby 20 eastern provinces, they chose to delay the conflict and instead focus on organizing and equipping themselves for war. They constructed intricate cave systems throughout the Judean foothills, complete with ventilation shafts, storage areas, and enough supplies for long-term shelter. However, the main use of these caves was for launching surprise attacks on the Roman soldiers, using their guerrilla tactics to gain strategic positions on the Romans. Their meticulous planning started to go into effect as Jewish forces began revolting against their oppressors in 132 CE. Simon Bar Kokhba, proclaimed by Rabbi Akiva as a messiah, emerged as the charismatic leader of this revolt, declaring himself Nasi, Prince of Israel. Under his leadership, a provisional government was established, and the coins were overstruck bearing inscriptions such as, "For the freedom of Jerusalem." This caught the Romans entirely off guard. The Romans had believed another Jewish revolt was impossible, especially after the destruction of the Second Temple and their previous military victories. So, it was a surprise to see that they were fighting again. This time, the Jews determined to win. As historian Barry Strauss explains, the Romans think once they destroy the temple, it's done, but they're wrong because they underestimate the Torah and they underestimate the other sources of resilience that exist in that society. Additionally, the Jewish rebels did not fight as a unified army, but rather engaged in numerous small-scale skirmishes. The Jewish rebels inflicted so much damage that many historians argue that they completely destroyed Roman legions. more specifically Legio 22nd Diotenaria. The Romans had clearly underestimated the strength and determination of the Jewish forces. If Rome wanted to win, it would have to alter their tactics. As stated by Cassius Dio once more, then indeed Hadrian set against some of his best generals. First of these was Julius Severus. Severus did not venture to attack his opponents in open at any one point, in view of their numbers and desperation, but by intercepting small groups, thanks to the number of his soldiers and under officers, and by depriving them of food and shutting them up. He was able, rather slowly, to be sure, but with comparatively little danger, to crush, exhaust, and exterminate them. Because of this change in tactics, the Romans ultimately destroyed the Jewish uprising.
After crushing the Jewish resistance, Emperor Hadrian enacted a series of ruthless punishments aimed at erasing Jewish cultural identity. The Romans outlawed central Jewish practices such as circumcision, Torah study, and religious gatherings. These actions reflected a broader strategy of control, not just cultural suppression. In addition to punishing the Jews, Hadrian reorganized his territories in order to further integrate the Jewish people into the Roman Empire. He established Roman colonies such as Aelia Capitolina and Jerusalem, and banned Jews from entering their sacred city other than on Tisha B'Av, the day that both the first and second temple were destroyed. He also implemented Roman taxation and legal systems. Moreover, he renamed the province of Judea to Syria Palestina. This was a calculated attempt to undermine the Jewish identity, as the name comes from the traditional enemies of the Israelites, the Philistines. However, the Jewish people refused to let this defeat define them. Even after the Bar Kokhba revolt left the lands in ruin and the population scattered, they clung to their faith, preserving their traditions and identity. Judaism's survival, however, required its people to reshape their religious lives, moving away from temple worship and instead towards a faith led by learning, law, and tradition. As the Center for Online Judaic Studies notes, Rabbi Yohanan also adapted the famous statement that the world rested on Torah, temple practices, and piety. With the temple no longer standing, Yohanan changed the second element of the statement to say that good deeds now atone for sins where animal sacrifice once did. The departure from relying on the temple for their religious duties marked the beginning of Rabbinic Judaism, which now focused on the teaching and practice of Jewish law, a form of Judaism which can be spread all over the world. These changes demonstrated the perseverance of the Jewish people, with them doing anything to keep their religion afloat.
Not only did the Bar Kokhba revolt bring swift immediate changes, but it also had long-lasting effects that shaped Jewish life for centuries. After the revolt, as part of Emperor Hadrian's retribution against the Jewish people, thousands of Jews were enslaved. This combined with the widespread depopulation of Judea caused the Jewish diaspora, Jews living outside their historical homeland, Canaan, to expand dramatically. Due to the expansion of Jewish diaspora after the Bar Kokhba revolt, as discussed earlier, Jews increasingly focused on spreading their faith orally through rabbis, a tradition that exists in the modern era. Ironically, Hadrian's attempt to eliminate Jewish life in Judea instead pushed it to flourish beyond its borders, laying the groundwork for the global Jewish communities that exist today. However, after the Bar Kokhba revolt, Roman anti-Semitism intensified. Following the Edict of Thessalonica, which made Christianity the state religion of the Roman Empire, these anti-Semitic mindsets spread to Christians as well. During the Middle Ages, Jews were framed for the deaths of Christians, blaming them for kidnapping people and using their blood for religious rituals. Jewish people also are now being held responsible for the death of Jesus. During the Crusades, Jewish people were persecuted for no apparent reason, as stated by a priest, and slaughtered the wandering Jews who admittedly were contrary to Christ, more from avarice for money than for the justice of God.
In modern Zionism, Simon Bar Kokhba and the entirety of the Bar Kokhba revolt is seen as, rather than a failure, a symbol of Jewish resilience. Unlike the diaspora Jew, someone perceived as weak and constantly fleeing persecution, Bar Kokhba is seen as one of the last ancient examples of a Muslim Jew, who, as stated by the Times of Israel, the Bar Kokhba revolt came to represent the hope that as the Jews returned to their homeland, they would be able to regain their honor by reclaiming their land, their language, and their ability to defend themselves. Though the Bar Kokhba revolt was viewed as a catastrophic failure, with hundreds of thousands of Jews killed, the enslavement and depopulation of Judea, the revolt allowed Judaism to transition into a much-needed phase of spiritual resilience. By shifting from temple-based worship to rabbinic Judaism, the Jewish people were allowed to preserve their identity despite the hardships they faced. Centuries later, the same resilience would inspire the ideals of modern Zionism, as the Jewish people were once again allowed to reclaim their homeland, culture, and independence.